Hello and welcome to our final episode of Locating Ethnography, Making a Place for Culture and Planning Practice, Research and Theory. Through the previous episodes, it has been made clear that ethnography and ethnographic knowledge does have a place in contributing to more responsive, holistic and inclusive urban planning, whether it be in promoting more greater representation and inclusion in planning literature and discourse, as we discussed in episode 2 with Yuri and Shannon, or its potential to contribute towards holistic sustainability, as Nadima pointed out in our discussion around Indigenous knowledge in episode 3. Asiba and I also demonstrated how cultural understanding of space can facilitate the design of more contextually appropriate spaces, as we reflected on a previous group project. In Spatializing Culture, the Ethnography of Space and Place, Professor Setha Lowe emphasizes the importance of ethnography and the idea that she terms spatializing culture as a tool that can be used to uncover and discover forms of exclusion and social inequality in space. This point leads to our final discussion for the series around ethnographic knowledge and participatory planning. In an article by Mattila, Olsson, Lappid and Ojanen titled Ethnographic Knowledge in Urban Planning, Bridging the Gap Between the Theories of Knowledge-Based and Communicative Planning, the authors illustrated that ethnographic knowledge can complement more inclusive participatory processes because they, and I quote, actively recognize people's diverse experiences. In cases where the outcome of participation is heavily dominated by the interests of actors like private businesses or actors that are more influential rather than local community members also having fair input, I think the incorporation of ethnographic knowledge is justified as it informs a more equitable representation in these participatory processes. The authors note that ethnographic knowledge will enable planners to firstly identify who the locals of the community are, and by doing this, they also will be able to better judge whether or not or to what extent the interests voiced in these local participatory processes are actually reflecting and representing that community rather than just being, dominated by one actor or that their voices are not heard. It also provides planners with a general understanding of the place. This will enable them to look beyond issues and the outcomes of these participatory processes, as they'll be able to, recognize and understand the unexpressed or silenced voices. As students, we have come across the term and the practice of participatory planning quite often, and we have come to look at it from a more critical view. And in my opinion, participatory planning does need to be looked at in a more creative way so that the approach to participatory planning is more inclusive and incorporates all of the community. And as we've seen in the cases where participation and the outcome of this participation is more dominated by a particular type of actor or particular interests, whether they be, private business interests or private sector related, or where there is this unequal relationship between the actors, and perhaps local community isn't represented, then the incorporation of ethnographic knowledge is actually justified because ethnographic knowledge, as explained by the authors or as argued by the authors, will inform a more equitable representation in these participatory processes. As the authors explain, ethnographic knowledge will enable the planner to both identify who the locals of a community are, and by doing this, the planners will thereafter be able to better judge whether not or to what extent the interests voiced and the outcomes of these local participatory processes are reflecting or are actually representing the interests of that community rather than being, rather than just taking whatever the outcome is, and maybe that outcome is, heavily dominated or heavily influenced by one actor, and there hasn't been great contribution from the community. And so ethnographic knowledge also provides planners with a greater understanding of the place and of different places. And this will enable them to look beyond what they are receiving in these outcomes and what they are receiving in these participatory processes. And this will allow them to actually recognize the unexpressed or perhaps even the silenced voices. The article further points out how ethnographic knowledge and processes can be utilized in places and situations where there is local resistance to planning projects. And in the current context of South Africa, where many of our communities from different cultural roots and in different parts of the country have growing disillusionment and distrust towards government and to planning officials due to feelings that they are not being heard in participatory processes and that their concerns and issues are simply not acknowledged or addressed in the subsequent policy frameworks and spatial interventions, ethnographers, who are the individuals that study culture in the natural environment, may actually act as the neutral players who the local community may be more entrusting towards and they may be more open to engage with. And these ethnographers would then collaborate with planners. And I was thinking about my research topic and the focus on the color spaces, which, in my opinion, are very rarely paid attention to, both in planning, research, and in the physical development of space. And I would imagine that there must be a strong opposition to not only planning interventions, but anything related to government. And in an article by Farrell Hafferty, she actually looks at the stagnant state of development and spatial change in colored spaces like Bosmont and Nuclear, and also how just voting rates are so low in these spaces because people feel like there's no point in voting because they still won't be represented. And so I argue that in the future, when we hopefully start paying attention to places, to colored spaces in planning, that we make use of ethnographers and ethnographic knowledge and processes as a starting point or a foundation to firstly better understand the workings of these spaces before we propose interventions. And this way, planning will be guided by the people rather than, guided by what we as planners or what theory proposes is best suited in that space. And so by actually firstly understanding how people interact with their spaces and how cultural groups interact with their spaces and with the built environment, it will allow us to have a more responsive approach and propose and provide more culturally appropriate and strategic interventions and plans. Thank you for watching this series. I really hope you enjoyed watching them as much as I enjoyed producing them. Please feel free to continue this conversation by leaving a comment or question below. There is much more to discuss, unpack, and think about when it comes to ethnography and planning. Bye for now.